When Harold Morrison vanished without a trace on a cold October morning in 1990, no one in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, could believe that a decorated war hero had simply evaporated into thin air. The 68-year-old man had fought bravely on the beaches of Normandy, survived the horrors of Omaha Beach, and returned home with medals that gleamed on his chest as symbols of unquestionable courage. His routine was as predictable as the sunrise: breakfast at 7, a walk to the park at 8, chatting with neighbors on the porch at 5 in the afternoon. But that Tuesday morning, Harold Morrison simply disappeared. And what they would discover 8 years later would forever change the way everyone saw the man they thought they knew. Harold wasn't just a respected veteran, he was the pillar of the community. The man who organized Veterans Day parades, visited schools to share war stories, and never refused to help a neighbor in need. His wife, Margaret, had seen him in the kitchen the night before, carefully polishing his old medals with the same care as always, his eyes distant, as if reliving memories only he could see. She fell asleep to the familiar sound of him pacing through the house in the middle of the night, a habit he'd developed since the war, when nightmares would often wake him. When she awoke that morning, the bed beside her was empty, but that wasn't unusual. Harold always rose before dawn, but this time was different. The coffee remained untouched in the pot. His medals were scattered carelessly across the kitchen table, something Harold would never do. And his wallet, keys, and all important documents were exactly where they always were. Margaret called his name through the house, checked the basement where he sometimes worked on his woodworking projects, and even the attic where he stored his war memorabilia. The silence that answered her was different from the usual quiet of the morning. It was a heavy silence, thick with an absence she had never felt before, not even during the long years when he was at war. That was when Margaret Morrison made the call that would change their lives forever. She phoned the police to report her husband missing. What she didn't know was that Harold Morrison hadn't simply disappeared. He had fled from something that had been chasing him for decades, a secret so dark he chose to abandon everything, his family, his community, his identity, rather than face the consequences of actions committed long ago, in times the world preferred to forget. And when the truth finally emerged 8 years later, when his old Harley-Davidson was found abandoned under mysterious circumstances, it would be more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The initial investigation into Harold Morrison's disappearance began with all the hopes of a case that would be resolved within days, but it quickly turned into a nightmare that would haunt the family and baffle local authorities. Detective Robert Chen, a 20-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, had seen dozens of missing persons cases, but something about Harold's vanishing had troubled him deeply from the start. The evidence didn't make sense. A meticulous and predictable man who had left his medals scattered, abandoned a half-finished cup of coffee, and walked out of his home without a wallet or any documents, as if he had been forced to leave in a hurry. Chen knew that when war veterans disappeared, there was often a dark reason behind it, memories that came back to haunt those who thought they had left the past behind. But Harold Morrison seemed to have made peace with his war ghosts decades ago. Margaret Morrison provided the police with a detailed list of her husband's habits, his favorite places, the friends he kept in touch with, but every lead turned out to be a frustrating dead end. Harold hadn't withdrawn money from his bank account, hadn't used credit cards, hadn't made phone calls, and his old Harley-Davidson was also missing, a detail that initially suggested he had voluntarily left on one of his solitary trips. Neighbors were interviewed extensively, but their statements only deepened the mystery. Some swore they heard the sound of a motorcycle leaving during the night. Others insisted Harold had seemed more nervous in recent weeks, constantly looking over his shoulder, as if he were expecting someone. A pattern was beginning to emerge, but the pieces of the puzzle refused to fit together in any way that made logical sense. Margaret pleaded for answers no one could provide, and each day without news made her agony more unbearable. The search expanded across the entire county, with rescue teams combing forests, lakes, backroads and abandoned properties in an operation that mobilized resources rarely seen in the small town. Helicopters flew over the region for days. Sniffer dogs followed trails that led nowhere, and community volunteers organized into groups that searched every square mile within a 100-mile radius of Cedar Falls. The Veterans Department was contacted to check if Harold had sought psychological or medical help in other cities, but his records showed a seemingly stable man who regularly attended routine appointments. Bulletins were sent to police departments in neighboring states. His photo was printed in local newspapers, and a special number was set up to receive public tips. But weeks turned into months, and Harold Morrison remained a shadow that had dissolved into the October morning air. It was during the third month of the investigation that Detective Chen made a discovery that would completely change the direction of the case. Hidden at the back of a locked drawer in Harold's office, he found a collection of old letters written in German, photographs that clearly weren't of family, and documents that suggested a life entirely different from the one Harold had shared with his wife and community. The letters were dated decades earlier, but some were surprisingly recent, and one of them, postmarked just 2 weeks before the disappearance, contained a single line in English that made Chen's blood run cold. "We know who you really are." The investigation had just taken a much darker turn, and Chen was beginning to realize that Harold Morrison might not have been the war hero everyone believed him to be. The letters discovered in Harold Morrison's secret office revealed a labyrinth of secrets that turned a missing person case into an investigation that questioned everything the Cedar Falls community thought they knew about their local hero. Detective Chen hired a German translator from the State University, and when the first translations arrived, the content was so disturbing that Chen decided to keep the information strictly confidential until he could fully understand its implications. The oldest letters spoke of special operations during the war, mentioned Eastern European locations that did not appear in Harold's official military records, and contained references to sensitive activities that had to remain buried forever. But it was the more recent letters that truly instilled fear. Messages from people who clearly knew intimate details about Harold's secret life and seemed determined to expose truths he had desperately tried to keep hidden. The final letter, the one with the threat written in English, had been postmarked in Detroit, Michigan, but the sender remained anonymous. Margaret Morrison was carefully questioned about her knowledge of her husband's military past, but her answers only deepened the mystery surrounding Harold. She insisted he had served as a regular soldier in Normandy, that his medals were awarded for bravery in conventional combat, and that he had never mentioned any kind of special operation or classified mission. When Chen showed her the photographs he had found, images of Harold in uniform she had never seen, standing beside men she didn't recognize, in locations clearly not French battlefields, Margaret was genuinely shocked and confused. One of the photos showed a very young Harold wearing a different uniform, standing in front of a building with German writing on it, smiling in a way Margaret described as eerily strange. She began to realize she had lived 45 years of marriage with a man whose past was a complete fiction. And if Harold had lied about his military history, what else had he lied about? The investigation expanded beyond the borders of Iowa when Chen contacted federal military archives, only to discover that large portions of Harold Morrison's service record had been classified and remained inaccessible even decades after the war. The few documents available confirmed his presence in Europe during the right time period, but the details of his activities were vague and contradictory, as if someone had deliberately obscured his true military role. Chen also uncovered that Harold had legally changed his last name in 1947, 2 years after returning from the war, something he had never mentioned to Margaret or anyone in the community. His previous name was Harold Zimmerman, of clearly German origin, And that revelation opened up terrifying possibilities about Harold's true allegiances during the global conflict. Chen began to suspect that Harold Morrison hadn't disappeared by chance, but because someone had finally uncovered secrets he had spent 5 decades trying to bury. The case took an even darker turn when Chen received an anonymous phone call from an elderly woman who refused to identify herself, but who provided information that seemed impossible to know unless she had intimate knowledge of Harold's secrets. The woman claimed that Harold was not who he said he was, that during the war he had done terrible and unforgivable things, and that there were still people alive who had never forgotten or forgiven his actions. When Chen tried to ask more questions, the line went dead, but the call had lasted long enough to be traced to a public phone booth in Chicago. The investigation was turning into an international hunt for ghosts of the past, and Chen was beginning to understand that Harold Morrison had not simply vanished from Cedar Falls, but from a much wider and more dangerous network of people who knew his true secrets. And somewhere his Harley-Davidson waited to be found, along with evidence that would reveal the most shocking truth of all. Detective Chen's decision to expand the investigation into international archives uncovered connections that turned Harold Morrison's disappearance into a matter of national security, drawing the attention of federal agencies. Declassified post-war documents revealed that Harold Zimmerman had been recruited into a highly secretive military unit known only as Operation Paperclip, a program that officially never existed, but which apparently involved the relocation and protection of German scientists after the war. The problem was that the records suggested Harold was not an American soldier protecting scientists, but rather someone whose true nationality and loyalties remained questionable even decades later. Federal agents arrived discreetly in Cedar Falls and took over parts of the investigation, but Chen managed to maintain enough access to continue uncovering truths that others would have preferred to keep buried forever. Margaret Morrison was subjected to more intense interrogations when the federal agents discovered that some of the mysterious letters mentioned details about Harold's current life that only someone close to him could have known. Although she maintained her innocence and genuine surprise at the revelations about her husband's past, small details she had ignored over the years began to emerge. Nightmares in German, scars he claimed were war wounds, but didn't match any medical records, and a strange obsession with international news related to war crimes and Nazi trials. Margaret began recalling whispered phone calls Harold made during the night, always in a language she couldn't identify, and how he would always change the subject when she asked about his family in Germany, whom he claimed to have lost during Allied bombings. The years following Harold Morrison's disappearance were marked by a series of false leads and investigations that led to dead ends, turning the case into an obsession for both Detective Chen and Margaret, who refused to accept that her husband could have simply vanished from the face of the earth. Sightings of Harold were reported in at least 17 different states. A man with a similar appearance spotted at a diner in Nevada, another buying supplies at a rural store in Montana, and even a German tourist photographed in Washington, D.C., who bore a disturbingly strong resemblance to the missing veteran. Each lead consumed limited police resources and sent investigators on frustrating journeys that inevitably ended with confirmation that it was not Harold Morrison. The community of Cedar Falls gradually lost interest in the case, and new local mysteries took over the public's attention. But Margaret remained vigilant, staying in touch with Chen and following every new lead with the desperate determination of a wife who refused to accept she might never learn the truth about the man she had shared half a century of her life with. Chen continued working the case even after other investigators were reassigned to more urgent priorities, and his nearly obsessive persistence began to take a toll on his health and personal relationships. He had developed a complex theory that Harold had not vanished voluntarily, but had been kidnapped or eliminated by people connected to the secrets of his military past. a theory that led him to unauthorized investigations that put his career at risk. During Iowa's long, lonely winters, Chen spent hours poring over German documents, teaching himself basic language skills to better understand the nuances of the threatening letters and forming connections with historians specialized in war crimes who confirmed his darkest suspicions about Harold's activities in the 1940s. The truth that was emerging was far more disturbing than that of an American veteran with secrets. Harold Morrison appeared to have been a German collaborator who had assumed a false identity and lived a carefully crafted lie for 5 decades. The discovery that would change everything occurred on a freezing morning in March 1998, when a group of urban explorers investigating abandoned properties near Detroit, Michigan, found something that would turn the Harold Morrison case from theoretical speculation into a shocking, tangible reality. Hidden in the crumbling garage of a defunct industrial factory, covered by 8 years of dust and debris, was Harold Morrison's 1987 Harley-Davidson, still bearing its Iowa plate and identification numbers confirming his ownership. But it wasn't just the discovery of the motorcycle that revolutionized the investigation. It was what had been concealed in secret compartments Harold had built into the fuel tank and under the seat. The explorers, initially only interested in photographing abandoned architecture, stumbled upon documents, photographs, and evidence that revealed a truth about Harold Morrison far darker than anyone had imagined. Detective Chen received the call about the discovery just as he was preparing to retire, but this final revelation would force him to confront the most disturbing reality of his entire police career. Forensic analysis of the Harley and its hidden contents revealed that Harold Morrison had meticulously planned his disappearance for months, perhaps years, before finally executing the plan in the early hours of that October morning in 1990. Hidden in the modified compartments of the motorcycle were thousands of dollars in cash, forged identity documents prepared for multiple new aliases, and most shockingly, photographs and detailed records of people Harold had apparently monitored and catalogued for decades after the war. Chen realized that Harold had not been a victim fleeing his pursuers. He had been the pursuer, maintaining surveillance on individuals who might expose his secrets. And when that protective web began to unravel, he chose to vanish before the truth could emerge. The Harley had been abandoned in Detroit because that was where Harold had unfinished business, people to meet, and one final identity to assume before disappearing forever. The documents hidden inside Harold Morrison's Harley-Davidson revealed the most shocking truth Detective Chen had ever faced in his career. Harold Morrison was not an American veteran who had collaborated with the Nazis during the war, but Klaus Richter, an SS officer who had orchestrated the execution of hundreds of civilians in a small French village called Oradour-sur-Vair in June 1944. The meticulously preserved photographs showed Klaus Richter in full SS uniform, overseeing atrocities that had been documented by the Nazis themselves as evidence of his efficiency in cleansing operations. Harold Morrison had never existed. That identity had been carefully constructed using the documents of a real American soldier killed in Normandy, whose body was never recovered and whose identity Klaus assumed amidst the chaos of the post-war aftermath. For 5 decades, this war criminal had lived as a respected American hero, married to an innocent woman, attending memorial ceremonies honoring the victims of men exactly like himself. The most devastating discovery among the documents was a detailed diary that Klaus had kept in secret all these years, recording not only his memories of the atrocities he had committed, but also his constant surveillance of Holocaust survivors and Nazi hunters who might one day identify him. Chen realized with growing horror that Harold had used his respected position in the veteran community to identify and monitor other veterans who might have served in units that liberated concentration camps or investigated war crimes. The threatening letters that had seemingly driven him into hiding were not from people who had just discovered his secret. They were from elderly survivors who had finally gathered the courage to confront the man who had destroyed their families decades ago. Men and women who had spent half a century pursuing justice against Klaus Richter. The revelation of Klaus Richter's true identity explained every strange and inexplicable detail of the disappearance that had baffled investigators through 8 years of frustrating investigation. His nightly nightmares were not the trauma of a brave American soldier, but the repressed guilt of a war criminal who constantly relived the atrocities he had committed against innocent families in occupied French territory. Margaret Morrison was devastated to discover that she had spent 45 years of marriage sharing a bed with a man responsible for the deaths of hundreds of civilians, including children, and that every moment of tenderness, every declaration of love, every year of marital happiness had been built upon a monstrous lie that defied her ability to comprehend or forgive. Detective Chen finally understood why Harold's military records had been so inconsistent. There were no legitimate records because Harold Morrison was a completely fabricated identity created by a fugitive Nazi. The documents revealed that Klaus had developed an elaborate system of self-preservation, which included the systematic elimination of anyone who might pose a threat to his false identity. For decades, he had used his respected position in the community to gather information about war crimes investigations, Holocaust survivors who had resettled in America, and even other Nazi criminals who might have knowledge of his past activities. When Chen analyzed at least 7 suspicious deaths in the region over the years, cases that had been ruled accidents or natural causes, a sinister pattern emerged. Every victim had connections to Europe during the war or had shown an interest in investigating Nazi crimes. Klaus Richter had not simply fled from his past, he had actively killed to protect his secrets, turning Harold Morrison into a mask behind which he continued his murderous activities on American soil. The investigation into Klaus Richter's current whereabouts led Chen and federal agents on an international pursuit that uncovered a network of Nazi war criminals who had assumed false identities and lived seemingly normal lives in American communities for decades. The documents found in the Harley contained addresses and codes that, once deciphered by intelligence experts, revealed that Klaus had maintained secret contact with at least 12 other war criminals scattered across the United States, Canada, and South America. They had developed an elaborate communication system that allowed them to alert each other to potential threats, share information on persistent investigators, and even coordinate the elimination of people who came too close to the truth. Chen realized that Klaus's disappearance in 1990 had been triggered not only by the threatening letters from survivors, but also by an international operation of Nazi hunters who had finally identified Harold Morrison as Klaus Richter. The search for Klaus Richter culminated in a discovery that shocked even the most experienced investigators accustomed to the depths of human evil. Through complex bank records and international money transfers, Chen tracked Klaus to a remote farm in Argentina, where he had settled under a third false identity, this time as Hans Müller, a German immigrant who raised cattle and appeared to live a quiet life with a new local wife who was completely unaware of his past. When Argentine authorities and American agents arrived at the property in May 1999, they found Klaus Richter, now 77 years old, still physically capable and mentally sharp, but utterly unprepared for the final confrontation with the justice he had avoided for over half a century. His arrest revealed that he had spent the last 9 years not in fearful hiding, but actively planning a return to the United States to eliminate those who had forced him to flee, including Margaret, whom he considered a potential threat for knowing intimate details of his daily life. The trial of Klaus Richter in 2000 became one of the most significant war crimes cases ever prosecuted on American soil, revealing not only the extent of his atrocities during World War II, but also the murderous network he had operated during 5 decades of seemingly respectable life in Cedar Falls. Margaret Morrison testified as the victim of one of the greatest emotional frauds in modern history, describing how Klaus had used his ability to simulate love and normalcy to mask a fundamentally psychopathic nature that had never changed since his days as an SS officer. The most shocking revelation of all was the discovery that Klaus had planned to secretly return to the United States, not to reunite with Margaret, but to systematically eliminate everyone who knew his true identity, including his own wife, before disappearing permanently under a fourth identity he had prepared in Brazil. His abandoned Harley-Davidson in Detroit had not marked the end of his escape, but rather the starting point for a final assassination campaign that would have erased all traces of Klaus Richter forever. The most disturbing conclusion of the case came when investigators discovered that Klaus had meticulously documented not only his past activities, but also his future plans, including a list of 43 individuals he considered threats to his security, a list that included not only Holocaust survivors and investigators, but also innocent neighbors from Cedar Falls who had shown too much curiosity about his past or behavior. Klaus Richter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but died in custody in 2003, taking with him secrets about other Nazi criminals that will never be revealed. Margaret Morrison spent her final years working with Holocaust survivor organizations, dedicating herself to ensuring that the memory of Klaus's victims was honored, and that her own experience served as a warning about how evil can disguise itself perfectly behind familiar smiles and gleaming medals. In Cedar Falls, the house where Harold Morrison had lived, his elaborate lie was turned into an educational memorial, reminding all that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who know how to hide their true nature behind the mask of goodness.